Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Sin and Tonic. Today's story is that of Ruth Ellis. Today we are off to London, baby. Let's go. Sin and Tonic! Hello my loves, I hope you're all okay today. Oh, that seemed very official. Today's case was suggested by a subscriber. Thank you so much. I do love a suggestion. I am just going to share with you how comfortable I am. I have got on like jogging bottoms, slippers, the comfiest cardi. Oh, yeah, comfy. No makeup, clean face, fresh skincare routine done. Yup. This is what happens when I film on a Sunday. Sundays are for cosy. Without further ado, let's go. So, Ruth Ellis was born in 1926 and she was born in Rhyl, Wales. She was one of 6 children and the family moved from Wales to London after the war. Her mother was called Bertha, her father was called Arthur, and the original family name was actually Hornby. Hornby. They're famous trains, I think. Toy trains, model trains. Don't come for me. Anyhow, her father was a cellist and he changed the surname of the family to Nilsson after the birth of one of his daughters. I'm not sure why. Maybe like it was his stage name or something like that. When Ruth was just 2 years old, in 1928, her father lost his twin brother in a tragic accident involving a steamroller. I can only imagine. Oh. And it was said that by Muriel, which is Ruth's older sister, that after this loss in his life, he started to become very violent, her father, and also sexually abusive towards Muriel. I know that some things can cause people to commit crimes, to break, like they call it like a stressor, don't they? There's a stressor in someone's life and then they commit a crime or do these awful things, and it would seem like that was the case with her father. So he lost his brother and he then started to just be violent towards his family, and his sexual abuse was aimed at that time at Muriel. Ruth, like I say, was only very young. She was still a baby. This resulted tragically in Muriel conceiving a child with her father, and the whole incident led to him being like questioned by the police and stuff, but it never really went any further. And then that child, it was a son, a baby boy, he was then brought up in the family as a sibling. So Muriel was his sister, even though she was really his mother. Oh, just what a mess. What a mess. Like, you can't even imagine the trauma of that. Like, what the hell? Anyhow, so that was the situation. And then Ruth, when she became of a certain age, when she reached puberty, it's just gross, isn't it? Her father then turned his advances towards Ruth. What the deuce, man? Ruth was very strong-willed. She was determined. She had a love of clothing and fashion and things like that as a child. Her mother said that she was very ambitious for herself. And she used to say to her, "Mum, I'm going to make something of my life." And it seemed like she really was a very determined child, girl, teenager. She did still suffer abuse at the hands of her father, sadly. I think from what I read, it was more like she was determined for it not to sort of break her spirit and her soul, and that it wasn't going to define her. I think that was like reading between the lines, that's where she was sort of going with that. She was like, he's not going to break me. When Ruth was around 16 years old, her brother was in the Royal Navy and he had a girlfriend called Edna Turvey. And when he came back from leave, Edna and Ruth, they met and they really hit it off. And at this time, this is when the family ended up moving to London. So her father, Ruth's father, came first on his own. He got a job as a live-in caretaker in some fashion. So he left the family in Wales. He moved to London. Ruth then met Edna, and Edna introduced young Ruth, to the high life, to London living, to clubs and pubs and going out and that sort of thing, and like being on the town. on the lash, having a good time. And Ruth loved it. She loved this. This was somebody that had ambition for herself. London was, can you imagine coming from Wales? She loved fashion. So it really was the place to be, and Ruth loved it. And so this was a strange choice, but yeah. So she was still young, so she was still having to live with parents. So she moved in with her father in London, even though he was abusing her, and he still was abusing her at that time. So she moved to be with him. I guess she made that choice. He'd been doing it since she was a young teenager, and it's sad, isn't it? But she wanted that lifestyle, so she moved in with her dad. But Edna also moved in. However, so even though her dad was abusing her, he also then was having an affair with Edna, who is his son's girlfriend. Wow. Wow. All of this, you can't write the things sometimes. I'm flabbergasted, can you tell? Anyway, so he's then having this affair with Edna, but Bertha, his wife, she comes to visit and she finds them in bed together. Wow. She just happens to find them in bed together. So Edna's out on her ear, and then Bertha moves the family to London. No thought of leaving the man that's, abusing your children, having an affair. No, let's just move closer, all be together so I can keep an eye on him. Right. In 1944, when Ruth was 17 years old, she was still enjoying the lifestyle, going out and having fun, and she met a soldier, a Canadian soldier. He was named Claire Andrea McCallum. So she became pregnant with this Canadian soldier. And from what I could gather, she was head over heels with this man. She gave birth to a son who she named after his father. So he was called Claire Andrea Nielsen. And the baby was known as Andy. They did that a lot as well, didn't they, back in the day? They gave people names, but they never used them. They were called something else. It's, cut people a break. Dad, Claire, the original Claire Senior, he sent money over and he would write and things like that. But he actually had a whole nother family in Canada, and he was married. And she didn't know this. I don't think she knew this. I think it came as a surprise. So he sent her money, but then he eventually stopped writing. He sent her some roses and basically ended their relationship and went to Canada to live with his original family. And it broke her. She was really, really devastated by that. Now she has a young son that she needs to support. So Andy went to live with her mother, Bertha, and Ruth just had to get lots of jobs, really. So she worked a lot. She worked in clerical jobs and factory jobs to just get enough money to support herself and her son. Ruth became really frustrated. This was not the life that she had envisaged, and she was ambitious, like her mother had said. And she then decided to try her hand at something else, which was nude modelling. I mean, that's a jump, isn't it? Factory working, clerical work. Oh, I'm going to get myself naked. But it paid well, and it led her into different circles, if you like. She went on to become a nightclub hostess, so this was incorporating the lifestyle that she really did enjoy, but it was dark because her manager at that club, he would blackmail and coerce and, probably just force the girls that worked for him into having sex with him. She became a full service escort, and then she got pregnant by one of her regular clients. So she then went off to have an abortion, and then she returned to work as soon as she could. And then this kind of blew my mind. So she did that job for quite a long time. And then in 1950, what have I done there? Press something I shouldn't. In 1950, she then met George Ellis, right? And they married, 1950. He was a regular at the Court Club, which is where she worked as a prostitute. So he knew what she did. I think I'm correct in this, but so when they married, I believe that she stopped doing what she was doing. He was a dentist, so he probably had quite a lot of money. He was divorced. He had 2 sons from that marriage. She obviously had Andy, and they had a very, very spicy relationship. He was violent, he was an alcoholic, and he was possessive. And I find that very bizarre that he chose to marry somebody at that time when he had met her, was in that profession. I just, like, he's setting himself up for a world of pain. Like I say, I think when she married him, she stopped working at the club. And then a year later, she left him a few times. She was like, she didn't want this for herself, the violence and the alcoholism and all of that. But that's kind of all she'd ever known. Her father was abusive. She had grown up in really awful circumstances. And I think, that was all she really knew. So she kept going back to George. And then in 1951, she fell pregnant and they had a baby. And again, she named that baby after the father. He was called George, and it was a daughter. She called her Georgina. However, George was really certain that she was having an affair. So he refused to believe that this child was his. He was like, nope. And that then ended their relationship. That was the end for Ruth. She left. So she's left George, and she has to move back with her parents. She's got 2 kids now. Moves back in with her mum and dad, and she goes back to the club and back to being an escort. And then it would seem that she started to she wanted to take control of her life, and she ended up becoming a manager of a nightclub in Knightsbridge. So she's sort of gone up the ranks, if you will. She ended up having celebrity friends. She was girl bossing it, and she was lavished with male attention, with expensive gifts. She was the hostess with the mostess. I'm not sure if at this time she was still being an escort, but it says that she was a manager of a nightclub, so I don't think so. Ruth lived in a flat above the nightclub, and it sounds like she was living her best life at this point. At this time, she met somebody called David Blakely. He was a racing car driver. He was a heavy drinker. Within weeks, Blakely had moved in to the flat above the nightclub. He was besotted. It was a quick sort of romance. They both really fell in love with each other, or, in lust with each other. It's very, very quick, but it was not without its problems. And again, quite quickly, she fell pregnant again for a 4th time, and she had her 2nd abortion because she knew that the relationship between her and David was strained. There were issues, and it had all happened very quickly as well. So this was a new relationship. What I need to look up, what's the deal with birth control then, because it must have been shocking. She just seemed to just get pregnant, so I guess it was shocking. Just had a quick Google. Yeah, it was shocking. So the pill wasn't developed until the mid 1950s, and then they did have condoms, but can you imagine? I bet they were bad, and bad quality. I bet they just weren't very good. Blakely's behaviour began to change as well. So he was smitten with Ruth, but he started to spend more and more time in the club, and he became possessive and jealous, and it started to affect her earnings. And she was a businesswoman, and this was a no-go. He also came into financial difficulties, and he was losing a lot of money. His habit of drinking and other things, he was squandering his wealth, and I don't think she wasn't too keen on that either. And then they began to fight. So they began to argue and fight, and it was a very passionate love-hate relationship. They adored each other, and there was a lot of passion between them, but also in a negative way as well. So when they would fight, it was fireworks. And then also Blakely, who was extremely jealous of Ellis getting all this male attention, he then ended up having a mistress, and Ruth found out about this. She didn't like this, so she took herself a lover. So it's very immature, isn't it? It's very immature and tit for tat. So they still lived together, Blakely and her, at this point, and then they both just took themselves another lover. greedy. So Ruth began a relationship with Desmond Cusson, and he was an RAF pilot. And then after the war, he had become an accountant. Now, Ruth ended up moving in with Desmond, but she carried on her relationship with Blakely. What a mess. What a mess. So she is with Desmond, who adores her, loves her, will do anything for her. And then she is continuing to sleep with Blakely, even though they have moved in with other people. In January of 1955, Ruth was pregnant again. I don't know who the father of this child is, whether it was Blakely or Desmond. She probably didn't know either. Just not a care in the world. Everyone's just flowing their stuff about. Blakely then offered to marry Ruth. Now, that makes me think that he thought the baby was his. I'm not sure, but he offered to marry her and she said yes. She's living with poor Desmond, so she's agreed to marry Blakely. They're not living together. They're still seeing other people. And then in a source that I read in 1955, in the January, she miscarried her pregnancy because Blakely had punched her in the stomach in one of their violent arguments. And she held that very deeply against Blakely. I mean, that's very tragic and very awful. And their relationship was then over. Fast forward to Easter Sunday, 1955, so a few months later. Ruth got into a taxi and she left Desmond's flat and went to the home of some of Blakely's friends. She thought that he was going to be there. And when she arrived there in the taxi, she saw Blakely's car drive off. So she paid the taxi and then she walked up the road to the Magdala pub. Sure enough, his car was parked outside and she waited patiently. At about 9:30 p.m, Blakely and his friend Colin, they came out of the pub and they walked towards Blakely's car. Blakely was looking for his keys. Ruth took out a revolver from her pocket and she shot at Blakely. The first shot missed him, so then he was aware that he was being shot at and he ran. He ran to get to the car, but the second shot, it hit him and it made him collapse onto the floor. She walked over to Blakely on the ground and she then shot 3 more bullets into him. So one of these shots, she had the gun like only about an inch away from his back. And she shot him 3 times while he was there and he was unable to move. There was 1 more bullet in the gun and she was seen standing over him trying to, like, it must have got stuck. Like that happens, I think, sometimes the bullet or the barrel was stuck or whatever. I don't know enough about guns. But she was trying desperately to get this like last shot. I think she'd fired, we're not hobbits. I think she had fired 5 shots into him. 1 had missed and the other 4 had gone in. And then she was trying to get this 6th bullet into him, but it didn't work. And she ended up firing it and it hit the pavement and it ricocheted off the pavement and it hit the hand of a passerby, Gladys Yule. So she got shot in the hand. Can you believe? So she got shot in the hand. She then obviously had to get treatment and she lost the use of her thumb. She was in shock after having done what she had done and she asked someone to call the police. There happened to be a police officer there, like off duty at the pub, and she was arrested. Blakely had received multiple fatal shots to his intestines, liver, lung, his aorta, and his trachea. It's a lot of damage, and he was declared dead when he got to the hospital. When Ruth was taken in, she appeared to be quite calm. She was in shock, but she was also with it, and she was examined a few times by medical people to assess whether she was of sound mind. They deemed that she was. And I think what happens next is I think people are really uncomfortable, or were really uncomfortable with it, because maybe because she was a woman, but maybe because it was just like unusual. It was such a strength of character, I suppose, and dignity, like her dignity. I'm not sure, but there's definitely something. I can't think of the word that I want for it, but she didn't deny what she had done. Obviously, she didn't. But more so, she didn't try and defend herself. When Ruth went into court, so you have numerous appearances, don't you, in court, and she On her first appearance or her second appearance, she dressed herself in like a black suit with a white silk blouse, and I mean, she was glamorous. She had her bleach blonde hair and red lipstick, and her counsel were, maybe not. Maybe you should like dull yourself down, be more demure. But the interesting thing with this case, and there was a lot of controversy around it as well, she didn't behave how people thought you should behave. She didn't call on the domestic violence that had happened between her and Blakely. She made no excuses for what she did. She wanted no reprieve, and she was adamant about it. And I think it was quite clear from her choices and how she was that she knew what she was doing. At the time, if you murdered somebody, you got the death penalty. That was the punishment. And she had no qualms with it. She made peace with it, it would seem. She did have moments of anxiety, but she chose to murder, and she intended to murder Blakely, and she knew the consequence of that would be her death. She knew that, and she was very clear about that, and people struggled with that. They struggled with it. Ruth had decided that already for herself. She knew that if she murdered him, and she intended to, that she would be given the death sentence, and she knew that. She wasn't contesting it, and it made people uncomfortable. Like, why aren't you trying to save your life? What is this? And people couldn't let it go. There were lots of incidents. Let me go through them. First of all, her family, her mother, obviously, her family were like, what are you going to do? How can we help you get out of this? And she said, I don't want to. I don't want reprieve. Her family couldn't give up, so they asked her solicitor, John Bickford, to write a letter to the Home Secretary, and he did. He wrote a 7-page letter outlining why she shouldn't get the death penalty. This was denied, but it was enough, and this is what I mean, she was like proper on it, so this was enough for Ruth to dismiss that solicitor. She was like, no, fired. So she got a new solicitor, Victor Mishkin. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. When they went to see her, to, chat with her because they were going to represent her, they wanted desperately to know where she'd got the gun, how she'd got the gun, but she didn't want to tell them that because she was adamant. She didn't want reprieve. She didn't want them to get her off of the death penalty. She wanted that. So, and it does sit but uncomfortably, doesn't it? It does sit uncomfortably. She was, it's eerie for somebody to be at peace with that and to not fight for themselves. It's sad. Eventually, Ruth would disclose to them that her partner, Desmond, had got the gun for her, and in the weekends leading up to when she murdered Blakely, Desmond had been showing her how to use the gun, and Desmond had also driven her to the pub. He had this invested interest in getting rid of Blakely himself because he was besotted with Ruth, and if Blakely was out of the picture, so there was all of this evidence that was there to suggest, or that could have been suggestive, that Desmond was really behind all of this. He'd provided her with the weapon, he'd driven her there, that he'd coerced her into it, and that would have been something that could have been brought to the court. But she was against that. She didn't want that. She was like, no, I killed him. I wanted to kill him. Despite this being her choice, these solicitors, and again, this was all taken further, and she hadn't wanted that to be the case, but it was all taken and looked into. However, it didn't change the death penalty because the sentence that she'd been given, because she was given the death sentence, because she had murdered somebody, and that was what happened. But it didn't change anything then, because it actually showed that she had premeditated the murder. So it worked against them. It was a different time, whereas now it might be that she'd got manslaughter or something. Obviously, she wouldn't get sentenced to death now, but she might not have been tried for murder. She might have been tried for manslaughter because of these other circumstances. So now we take that into account. She was abused her whole life by men. And then Blakely, she was a victim of domestic violence. And so they had this, it was a crime of passion. And all of that now would be taken into account. But back then, it was not. It was very black and white, very cut and dry. She killed someone, she admitted to it, and she was seen by witnesses, and therefore she got the death penalty. She wrote to Blakely's parents when she was in prison, and she said, "I've always loved your son, and I shall die still loving him." She probably had so much anger that he had caused a miscarriage. Also, it felt like everything happened very quickly. So she murdered Blakely in April, and then she was set to be executed in July. I mean, now think about death row and things like that, and how long people, and how, it's a long affair, isn't it, from when they are given their sentencing to when they are actually then put to death. But this was April, so 3 months. 3 months, all of that, 3 months. That's so quick. She was executed on the 13th of July 1955, and just before 9 a.m, her executioner came into her cell to get her and take her next door to the execution room. It seems like so weird that it was actually such a short time ago that we did that here. The executioner was called Albert Pierpoint. He said that before her execution, she smiled at him. Just kind of creepy. Yeah. Like, in what way? I don't think in a Larry way, but I think in a, almost, in my head, almost like it's okay. Like, it's okay. Like, it felt like she'd really accepted her fate. And then what they did then was that they buried people that were hanged in the prison yard in an unmarked grave. In the 1970s, the bodies of executed women were removed and then reburied elsewhere. Andy was her next of kin, her son, and he asked for her body to be buried where? St Mary's Church in Amersham, Buckinghamshire. Her headstone was inscribed with Ruth Hornby, 1926 to 1955. Interesting, because she was born Ruth Nilsson, I believe. And then tragically, Andy, her son, he unalived himself in 1982, and just before he did that, he went to her grave and he desecrated her gravesite. I think there was a lot of anger towards his mother, because I can't imagine that feeling, because her family desperately wanted her to fight her sentencing, to get reprieve, so that she could be there for her children, and she didn't. And I didn't think about that when I was sort of thinking about the case, but she had Andy was 11 and her daughter was 4, and it's all very well and good sort of, I accept my fate, I know what I've done, but she didn't then fight. Yeah, that's such an abandonment, isn't it? Like, you don't care enough to fight to be here for me. After her execution, there was so much more tragedy in her family. It was honestly, it's so unbelievable, this case. So her ex-husband, George Ellis, he went into he was an alcoholic. He went on to unalive himself in 1958. In 1969, her mother, Bertha, was found in a room filled with gas, seemingly on purpose, and she survived, but it left her permanently brain damaged. So she was not well for the whole remainder of her life. She was incoherent, she couldn't speak, she couldn't talk. It was another tragedy for that family. And her daughter, Georgina, she passed away in 2001 from cancer, but she was only 50 years old. It's just such a tragic story for this family. The trial judge in Ruth's case ended up paying for the upbringing of Andy, her son. I think it was one of those cases that touched people, and it did sit bad. It caused so much controversy as well. There was a campaign to pardon Ruth in 2003, and the court were a bit pissy about it. They were like, is this a good use of our time? Because basically she didn't want a reprieve back in 1955, and the law back in 1955 was that if you committed murder, you were sentenced to death. So they dismissed it, so she wasn't pardoned. And then in 2007, there was another petition for the Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, to look into this and to consider pardoning her because there was evidence that was not made known at the trial and things like that. And it's just, yeah. But it didn't happen. Back in 1955, execution was supported as a whole in Britain. However, 10 years later, it was abolished. And Ruth's case helped set the wheels in motion for that to happen, because people were starting to see that there was more grey rather than black and white. And yeah, people really did fight. It became more of a thing to fight for that to be abolished. Took another 10 years though. Ruth's case was adapted for television and film. In 1980, it was part of a series called Lady Killers. I think it was his third episode. And then there was a film made about her in 1985 called Dance with the Stranger. There's been a play written about it. There was another film that was made about her executioner, a musical, an opera. Honestly, her story has just sparked, like, what would you call it? Creativeness in so many areas. Mad, really, isn't it? Oh, in 2023, it's been announced that there will be an adaptation of Ellis's story, with Ellis being portrayed by Lucy Boynton. So it's still creating. So even now, even today, God alive. What are my thoughts? My thoughts on it are that she had such a tragic life. She was abused and taken advantage of by every man that came into her life. Having relationships with alcoholic, violent men was familiar to her, because that's what, how she'd been brought up. That was like her father was like that. But it always seemed to be that she didn't want to be a victim of it, did she? So she even said that right back in the early stages when she was beginning to be abused by her father. She told her sister, I'm not going to let this, I'm not going to let this happen to me like it's happened to you. So she always sort of had a fight in her. She did leave George numerous times, so he was violent towards her and she would leave. So I think she had something about her that was, I'm not going to be a victim to this, even though she was technically a victim of domestic violence and abuse, and that club owner as well in her early career. I think it was almost a last sort of defiant move by her, and that's probably what was so difficult for her son to handle, because she chose that stance over being there for her son. She would have been in prison for her whole life, I imagine. I don't know what happened then. So if you didn't get the death penalty, did you just have a very long prison sentence and stay, or were you in prison for life? I'm not sure, but she would have been alive and he would have been able to see her. It's just a tragedy. I feel like that's how she went down. She didn't want to be a victim to it. So the reprieve and all of that sort of stuff, I think she was working so hard against that, because that's not what she wanted. She was like, no, I meant to kill him. I'd had enough. And I think, yeah, so she lived by the sword, died by the sword sort of thing. Is that what you would say? Anyhow, that's my view on it. I am always interested to read the comments and see what you guys think about these cases. But it feels like that was her choice. That's what she wanted to do. I don't feel like it doesn't strike me that she was coerced by Desmond. I think that was what she wanted to do, and she almost, I have no idea, I wasn't there, but the person that she was, through what I've read, it would more likely be that she roped Desmond in to get her the gun and to help her out, is more what I think. I don't think he was pulling strings. Doesn't seem like she was the sort of person for that to be going on. Anyhow, that is all I have for you on today's case. I've got a horrible feeling that I have forgotten something about this one because there was so much to it in the end. It felt really cut and dry. When I first looked into it, I was like, oh right, okay, so she went there. Oh, something else that I have forgotten is there were these holes, you know, the Magdala, where she shot him outside on the pavement, and there were these holes in the wall of that pub, and people thought that they were bullet holes. But cheeky, the owner of the pub in the 1990s just drilled some holes into the wall, and like, you know, and so this rumor began that they were bullet holes, but they were not. They were not. It was fake. Very naughty. Get the punters in. How are we all this fine day? I'm nearly ready for Christmas. I think everything is in order. There's a few more things to do. I think I'm sorted. Well, other than wrapping, I really don't like wrapping. I'm not very crafty, to be honest. I'm not patient either, and I think you've got to be patient. And it always hurts my back. So someone said get an ironing board and like stand up and have a little station. Do it like that. Might do something like that. Put Criminal Minds on the TV and just stand there and like be a little elf. Might do that. But yeah, that's the only thing really left to do. How are you getting on? What do you do? Also, some of you are in really hot places, and I find that bizarre. So like at Christmas time, it's warm. I can't imagine that. It's always cold here because it's winter. It's not always snowing, not where I live. If you go up north, it's snowing all the time, but not here. Yeah. Can't imagine being hot on Christmas Day. Well, actually, no, I can, because it gets warm. Like when you've got all the cooking going on and all the eating, I get rosy red cheeks, normally because of red wine, but like you eat a lot and the heating's on, so you are warm and sometimes hot, actually, I'm going to be honest. And everyone's windows steam up and it's lovely. It's really nice. So like if you do look out, you're just like, oh, we're all doing the same thing in our houses, pretty much. Obviously, some people are like out and having dinner somewhere or in a pub or whatever. Some people go and have an Indian down the Indian. Yeah, so sometimes, you know, especially if you've got a Christmas jumper on. I can't wear a Christmas jumper because I do get too hot. However, I can't imagine like just outside being sunny and hot, and like when you walk outside it's like hot. I can't imagine it. Yeah, I can't imagine like seeing Christmas decorations in summer sun either. It's fun, isn't it? Like in Australia, do you have Christmas films made? You must do. You must have Christmas films where it's in Australia and it's hot and sunny and you're having a barbecue. That's mad, isn't it? My brain has just suddenly thought that. That's crazy. Wow. How funny. I'm going to love you and leave you. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Sin and Tonic. I hope you join me next week for another true crime story in a glass or a vase or a mug of gin. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Bye.